Uh, so it's great to welcome Larry again for this Zoom. And Larry's speaking on, as we know, the Philemon 9 in light of the recent research on the ideology of age in antiquity, which is apparently quite a hot topic at the moment. They say that that if you're 70, that's the new 50.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. So I don't think a Philemon 9 will have anything to say about that, but anyhow, so welcome, Larry. And most of us will know you. You're a long-time visitor to Macquarie, on the staff at one stage, and often speaking at the SEC conferences, in which we really appreciated your insights. Uh, and on Saturday, you'll be also speaking on Pauline people in the Corinthia. So that'll be quite interesting as well. So it's over to you, Larry.
Thank you. And thanks to all who have joined by Zoom. I see so many valued colleagues. Don, thank you for mentioning the years that I spent on the staff at Macquarie. One of the things that I am most proud of in life is the fact that I was involved in the successful completion of 12 PhD projects at Macquarie University. And my former students are scattered not only across Australia, but even now across the world. So Macquarie has been a really wonderful part of my life. And some of my best friendships are with those of you who have joined today, especially Don Barker, Alana Nobbs, Jim Harrison, Mark Harding, and Alan Cadwallader. Well, I am grateful for the opportunity to offer a paper on what is for me a new area of research, old age in antiquity. And I'm focusing on, in this paper, on Philemon verse 9, in light of recent research on the experience and ideology of age in antiquity. Leslie, can I ask you now to share the little document that I sent on the share screen? Thank you. Thank you so much, Leslie. That's wonderful. Now, I need to go back to my text. So, Leslie, can you lower that? Can you lower the share screen for just a moment?
You want me to? Okay.
Well, no. While you've got it up here, I'll just point out the quotation, of course, from Philemon 9, where Paul describes himself as an old man and now also a prisoner. And then the quotation from the great Antiochian commentator Theodoret of Cyrus, where he recognizes that in Philemon 9, Paul is referring to his age. He points out the gray hairs brought forth by his labors, and concludes, show regard for Paul, show regard for my old age. And then, Leslie, if you scroll down just a little bit, you'll see the bibliography. There's been a real surge of interest in old age as a social and cultural phenomenon in the Greco-Roman world. And I've picked out what I regard as the most important contributions. And I'll just highlight the wonderful book by Karen Cockayne,
Yeah. Okay.
Experiencing Old Age in Ancient Rome, and the book by Tim Parkin, Old Age in the Roman World, a scholar from the Antipodes. So now, Leslie, if you'll take that down, I'll commence with my little paper. The Apostle Paul is the only writer in the New Testament who makes a statement about his age, appealing to Philemon on behalf of his slave Onesimus. Paul describes himself in the following manner: being such as I am, Paul, an old man, and now also a prisoner of Christ Jesus. The great Antiochene commentator Theodoret of Cyrus clearly recognized the term presbytes in Philemon 9 as a reference to Paul's old age, but modern interpreters have been reluctant to embrace this understanding, preferring to translate presbytes as ambassador. Among interpreters who judge that Paul is referring to his age, few explore the implications of Paul's self-description for his rhetorical strategy, his psychological state, and his social role. A notable exception is Ronald Hock, who argued that by identifying himself as an old man and a prisoner, and Onesimus as his child, Paul cast himself in the role of an old father who is in need of his child's support, an accepted convention of children toward their aged parents. Meanwhile, in the last few decades, there has been a surge of interest in old age as a social and cultural phenomenon in the Greco-Roman world. And yet, apart from a few studies of the pastoral epistles, the growing body of knowledge about age as an aspect of social identity has not been imaginatively applied to the writings of the New Testament. Thus, one may hope that recent research will open fresh insights into the only New Testament writing in which the author identifies himself as old. But first, it is necessary to counter the interpretation of presbytes in Philemon 9 as ambassador, and to identify, if possible, the sources of resistance to Paul's description of himself as an old man. In his commentary on Philemon, John Calvin may be said to have initiated the modern debate over whether to render presbytes as old man or ambassador. Although Calvin retained the term synex in his translation, he remarked at the end of his exposition of Philemon 9, quote, "The designation presbytes here denotes not the age, but the office, non aetatum sed officium," adding, "For this reason, he calls himself an apostle." In Calvin's comments, the concern becomes audible that Paul's reference to his age may somehow diminish his authority. Calvin insists, quote, "He does not mean that they whom Christ has appointed to be apostles are destitute of authority." Well, as we shall see, a concern about Paul's authority runs through the interpretive tradition of presbytes as ambassador. Then, in the 18th century, the great Cambridge classicist Richard Bentley offered a conjectural emendation of the text of Philemon 9, which happened to accord with Calvin's view of Paul's meaning. He proposed the addition of a single letter, an epsilon, to the problematic presbutes, thus producing the word that he thought Paul intended, presbutes, that is, legatus. Bentley judged that the emendation was supported by the language of Ephesians 6:20, presbuo in haluse, and 2 Corinthians 5:20, huper Christou presbuomen. The reason Bentley offered for viewing presbutes as a definite improvement, certa emendatio, was not only the appearance of the verb presbuo in certain Pauline texts, but a speculative calculation of Paul's probable age at the time of composition of the epistle to Philemon. Observing that Paul is described as Neanias, a young man, at the stoning of Stephen in Acts 7:58, Bentley questioned whether Paul could possibly refer to himself as an old man in Philemon 9, asking, ergo quomodo presbutes? Beneath Bentley's conjecture and its rationale, one senses an aversion to the category of old age as applied to the apostle, as if by being old, Paul would have lost some part of himself. Both sources of resistance to Paul's description of himself as an old man combine in the influential commentary on Philemon by John Barber Lightfoot. In his comment on Philemon 9, Lightfoot relates that he was inclined to read presbutes rather than presbutes on account of the comparable language of Ephesians 6:20, even before he became aware of the conjectural emendation proposed by Bentley. Thus, being convinced that Paul spoke of himself as an ambassador, Lightfoot began to question whether any emendation was necessary. Lightfoot argued that by Paul's time, the difference between presbutes and presbutes had begun to vanish in common usage, so that presbutes might be used with the meaning ambassador. In support of this assertion, Lightfoot adduced several Septuagint manuscripts in which the two nouns appear to be used interchangeably, along with Ignatius Smyrnian's, where the manuscripts read Theopresbutes, although the meaning is clearly an ambassador of God. Lightfoot's further comments reveal the assumptions underlying his preference for ambassador as the meaning of presbutes. First, Lightfoot supposes that the point of Philemon 9 is to, quote, enforce Paul's right to command, arguing that the addition of the qualifier Christou Jesu to the words presbutes and desmios, quote, suggest an appeal to authority. Second, Lightfoot allows that he finds a reference to Paul's age in Philemon 9 problematic. Quote, it is difficult to understand how Paul should make his age a ground of appeal to Philemon, who, if Archippus was his son, cannot have been much younger than himself. Well, Lightfoot's interpretation attracted many adherents. Some scholars repeat and augment Lightfoot's lexical argument that old man and ambassador are equally viable translations of presbytes so that only the context can determine which meaning is preferable. Other scholars offer syntactical arguments for understanding presbytes as ambassador, and some others provide rhetorical analyses in support of taking presbytes as ambassador. Throughout the interpretive tradition, which renders presbytes as ambassador, one encounters two sources of resistance to the idea of Paul as an old man. First, a concern to defend Paul's apostolic authority against the encroachment of age. And second, a recoil from the image of the elderly Paul as pitiable. For example, F.F. Bruce reasons, quote, if Paul did refer to himself here as an old man, then his appeal would appear to be based upon pity. But Paul did not regard his being a prisoner of Christ Jesus as a disgrace or as a situation calling for pity. To him, it was a matter of pride. Therefore, we should expect the term which Paul uses in such close conjunction with this to be also a designation of honor. And the more recent versions are probably right to prefer the rendering ambassador to old man, end quote. Marcus Barth and Helmut Blanke, in their commentary, reject the translation old man as contributing to the notion that Paul, quote, displays a lachrymose self-pity, concluding that, quote, a sentimental way of exhortation is out of the question because it does not comport with the reality of Paul's rightful authority. Well, if the number of scholars favoring the interpretation presbytes as ambassador has declined in the last 25 years, and if the New Revised Standard Version has opted for the translation old man rather than ambassador, it is because the foundation of the modern preference for the reading ambassador has crumbled piece by piece. First, all Greek manuscripts of Philemon 9 read presbytes, an old man, without evidence of any other reading and without indication of any difficulty perceived in the word. That is, there is no manuscript evidence to justify the substitution of presbytes, ambassador, for presbytes. Second, the conjectural emendation proposed by Bentley has been shown to be without merit on the basis of an investigation of the papyri done. J.N. Birdsall demonstrated that, quote, changes of epsilon upsilon to upsilon, such as Bentley supposes to have occurred in the transmission of the text, are extremely rare, whether in the Ptolemaic, the Roman, or the Byzantine periods. When it occurs, there is no deductible phonetic reason. Third, the lexical argument of Lightfoot that presbytes might be indifferently written for presbytes has been undermined by the discovery of new manuscripts and by further evaluation of the textual tradition. A papyrus manuscript of Ignatius Smyrnians has come to light, which reads Theopresbytes rather than the previously known Theopresbytes adduced by Lightfoot. Now, to be sure, in some Byzantine manuscripts of the Septuagint, instances of presbytes as a variant for presbytes occur, namely those cited by Lightfoot. But these instances should be regarded as natural errors, occasioned by the greater familiarity of the former term and the rarity of the latter, and cannot support the conclusion that the scribes regarded these terms as synonymous. That an error did not occur in the copying of Paul's epistle is indicated by the unanimous attestation of presbytes throughout the whole manuscript tradition of whatever date. So, if we accept that Paul describes himself as an old man in Philemon 9, what does this tell us? First of all, about Paul's age at the time of composition of this epistle. It must be acknowledged that there is no agreement in ancient sources on when old age began. As Tim Parkin observes, literary evidence from antiquity may be adduced to show that old age could be stated as beginning as early as the age of 42 years or as late as 77 years. Nevertheless, in sources from the 1st century BCE onwards, the age of 60 is commonly mentioned as the threshold of old age. In De Specialibus Legibus, Philo uses presbytes to designate a man who has lived beyond the age of 60. In De Opificio Mundi, Philo records a tradition ascribed to Hippocrates, which divides human life into 7 ages: the little boy, the lad, the young man, the elderly man, presbytes, and the old man, geron, and explains that these ages are measured by multiples of 7. According to this calculation, a presbytes would be somewhat less than 60, that is, a man 50 to 56 years old. Other systems of reckoning the ages of man are found in astronomical and medical writers. Ptolemy articulated a 7-fold division of life, each age under the influence of a planet, ingeniously calculating the duration of each stage of life in proportion to the orbit of the corresponding planet around the Earth. Accordingly, elderly age, he presbytike helikia, allotted to the planet Jupiter, lasts 12 years, from 56 to 68, while to Saturn falls old age, he gerontike helikia, from 68 to the end of life. Well, it may be doubted whether these ancient scientific divisions of human life, with their obvious preference for numerology, had any influence upon Paul when he described himself as a presbytes. But ancient testimony is generally consistent with the idea that old age began at the age of 60, a conclusion which is confirmed by the rather limited evidence of the papyri. For example, in Papyrus Florentius 150, a certain Victor is described as a presbytes of about 68 years. As an elderly man, of about 60, to what proportion of the population of the Greco-Roman world would Paul have belonged? An answer to this question necessitates consideration of the probable age structure of ancient society. The calculations of the demographers put average life expectancy at birth in the ancient world in the range of 20 to 30 years. In large measure, this average life expectancy was the result of high infant mortality. But the mortality rate of those who survived infancy may also have been high, owing to the chronic malnutrition of the poor and the lack of public hygiene that might have prevented the spread of disease. To be sure, some individuals are known to have lived longer, especially persons from the upper class. But if we adopt the estimates of the demographers and take the average life expectancy at birth to be 25 years, then only between 6% and 8% of the population would have reached the age of 60. It is worthy of note that Paul describes himself as old. Researchers on old age, both historians of antiquity and modern gerontologists, recognize that in everyday life, old age is not usually defined chronologically, but is rather a result of a subjective and intersubjective assessment. One is old when one sees oneself as old, and when one is treated as old by others. When and how this happens is dependent upon a number of social and cultural factors. The great Dutch Catholic commentator on Paul's epistles, Willem Hessels van Est, suggested that Paul had aged prematurely in consequence of what he had suffered as an apostle, and that Paul's consciousness of this condition comes to expression in Philemon 9. In 2 Corinthians 11, verses 23 to 25, Paul lists the hardships that he endured as a minister of Christ: imprisonments, floggings, near-death experiences, 5 times the Jewish punishment of 40 lashes minus 1, 3 times beaten with rods, once he was stoned, 3 times shipwrecked, a night and a day adrift at sea. There can be little doubt that such torturous experiences resulted in premature aging in the case of Paul. Moreover, Moses Finley emphasized that class distinctions governed the way in which old age took hold of a person in antiquity. In his essay on old age, De Senectute, Cicero concedes that, quote, old age cannot be easy in extreme poverty. In 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 11 and 12, Paul recounts the privations he suffered as an apostle of Christ. Quote, to the present hour, we are hungry and thirsty. We are poorly clothed and beaten and homeless, and we grow weary from the work of our own hands. Hunger was endemic among the lower classes of the Roman Empire, and homelessness was the occasional lot of the poor. Both conditions would have fallen with special force upon the elderly and would have accelerated Paul's process of aging. But surely imprisonment would have contributed most to Paul's sense of himself as aged because of the lack of proper nourishment, the prevalence of disease, and the incidence of torture by prison guards. In Philippians chapter 1, verses 21 and 22, Paul reveals that death might be considered a gain under the harsh conditions of his imprisonment, and implies that he actually might prefer death. How then does Paul's description of himself as an old man function in the argumentative rhetoric of his appeal to Philemon? First, although the commentators are averse to the idea that Paul is appealing to pity, ancient literature makes clear that old age was regarded as pitiable. You probably know the quotation of Seneca from his 108th epistle, that old age is a disease that cannot be cured. In the collection of references to old age in Stobaeus Florilegium, the vast majority, convey a negative image of old age. In the Pseudo-Platonic Axiochus, dated to the 1st century BCE, Socrates quotes from a discourse by the sophist Prodicus, which describes the effects of nature upon an aged man. Quote, "Then undetected there steals over your old age, into which all things pernicious and deadly in nature flow together. And if you do not hasten to give up your life as a debt that is due, then nature, like a petty usurer, steps in and grabs her pledge. First your sight, then your hearing, and often both. And if you hold out, she paralyzes you, mutilates, and tears you asunder." A lengthy passage in Juvenal's 10th satire describes old persons as losing their physical and mental faculties. An old man is one in whom, quote, "diseases of every kind dance around in a troop." And Juvenal elaborates, quote, "One suffers in the shoulder, another in the loins, a third in the hip. Another has lost both of his eyes and envies those who have one. Another takes food into his pallid lips from someone else's fingers." Juvenal continues, "But worse than all bodily ills is the senescent mind. Men forget what their own servants are called. They can't recognize yesterday's host at dinner, or finally, the children they begot and brought up." Pliny the Younger describes an acquaintance, Domitius Tullus, as a pitiful example of the negative aspects of old age. Despite his great wealth, Tullus is a hopeless invalid, fortunate only that he has a wife and slaves to tend him. The discrepitude of Tullus is described in brief but vivid and disgusting detail. Quote, deformed and crippled in every limb, he could only enjoy his enormous wealth by contemplating it, and could not even turn in bed unless he was manhandled. He also had to have his teeth cleaned and brushed for him, a squalid and pitiful detail. With a view to the impoverished conditions of Paul's life described in 1 Corinthians 4, a passage from the 2nd century CE philosopher Juncus, preserved in Stobaeus, notes the additional miseries which poverty brings upon the aged. Quote, if, moreover, poverty happened to befall a man when he had become old, he would himself pray to be freed totally from life. This is because of his deprivation in all respects, not having anyone to guide him, nor a source of support, nor having adequate clothing, and lacking shelter and food. There are times when he does not even have someone to draw some water for him. That persons made their age a grounds for appeal for the remission of duties and obligations is illustrated by a 2nd century CE papyrus, BGU 180, which is a petition in which a veteran asks for release because he is an anthropos presbutes kai monos tunkane. He happens to be an old man and he is alone. That in describing himself as an old man and a prisoner, Paul is appealing to Philemon's emotions, is therefore likely. Ancient rhetorical theorists, from Plato to Hermogenes, emphasize the importance of the pathetic proofs in the creation of persuasive discourse. The stirring up of the emotions is regarded by Cicero as one of the principal tasks of the orator. It should permeate the whole speech, all the parts of which are directed toward psychagogia. Only, I think it should be questioned whether the emotion to which Paul appeals is pity, or rather something deeper. 3 times in the epistle, Paul invokes agape as the emotion which binds all of those involved in the correspondence: Philemon, the saints in his household, and Paul himself. 3 times Paul refers to the splankna, that is the affection which connects all in Christ. So it is not pity to which Paul appeals, but a deeper emotion: affection, compassion, love. Nevertheless, the commentators are not wrong who view Paul's description of himself as an old man and a prisoner as an appeal for the respect that is due to an older man because of his experience, endurance, and wisdom. In his De Senectute, Cicero refutes the specific complaints against old age. Cicero places the dialogue into the mouth of the venerable Cato the elder, who is 83 years old at the time of the dialogue. And Cato, the novus homo with dignitas, serves as the exemplar of a praiseworthy old age, active and influential to the end of his life. Cato argues that the old man can provide a fine example of moderation and good sense, together with sound advice. The greatest pleasure of old age, that is, the apex senectutis, is held by Cicero, speaking through the mouth of Cato, to be auctoritas, the prestige and respect that an old man may enjoy if he has led an active public life. A positive message about the dignity of old age is conveyed by the veristic old age portrait bust, which appeared during the 1st century BCE. Portraits which depict wrinkles, folds of loose, flabby skin, sunken cheeks, and balding heads. And yet, these features are thought to represent the dignitas and gravitas of age. Importantly, these portraits reveal how these old people wanted to be seen. The depiction of old age is deliberate. The old are consistently depicted with serious expressions. The wrinkles and the solemn facial expressions were intended to elicit a response from spectators. So the exaggerated wrinkles and folds of skin created a topography of virtue, so to speak. They were suggestive of years of experience and time-induced strength of character, of hard work and service to the community. What is interesting to me is that the Libertini continued to adhere to this realistic style of portraiture down to the end of the 2nd century of the Common Era. And they are ordinary people, men and women, working people, as shown by the attributes of their trade carved at their sides. In his essay on whether an old man should engage in public affairs, Plutarch argues that the man of state must not retire on account of his age, because there are many useful tasks that he is capable of performing and that he has a duty to perform. Old age, Plutarch asserts, is a time of honor, though not of vulgar ambition. Length of years provides the statesman with qualities such as reason, judgment, frankness, parrhesia, soundness of mind, and practical wisdom, all of which not only entitle but even require the old man to continue to be active in politics. So the old should at least instruct the young so that they will be ready to take over more prestigious positions later. In terms of the logical proof in Paul's argument, I think that Ronald Hock has successfully analyzed Paul's appeal to Philemon. Paul cast himself in the role of an old father who is in need of his child's support. Now, Ronald Hock's argument was criticized by G.K. Beale in his commentary because The word presbutes does not appear in the texts which Hawk cited, but in Xenophon's novel, An Ephesian Tale, the word is found. The word presbutes. Here it is. The tutor of Habrocomes, described as an elderly man, presbutes, venerable in appearance and pitiful on account of his old age, is unable to bear Habrocomes' abduction, and so throws himself overboard into the sea and swims after the trireme, crying out, "Why are you abandoning me, my child, Technon? The old man, your pedagogue." In fact, the broader point that Ronald Hawk was making is confirmed by legal text. The parental expectation of care, therapeia, by their children was a feature of Greek society. Athenian law mandated that elderly parents be fed, housed, and cared for by their sons. The filial duty of caring for parents was underscored on public occasions, such as the annual examination of new civic officers who were asked whether they had treated their parents well. In a fragment of Menander's play, The Farmer, a slave explains that a young man, thinking an elderly farmer to be his father, cared for the old man when he was injured, raised him up, kept on anointing his wound, rubbing him down, washing the wound, bringing him food to eat, comforting him when he was suffering, and by his care restored and brought him through alive. The farmer, grateful for such nursing, is described as being alone and an old man. Monos teon kai geron. Finally, Paul's confidence, despite his old age, is noteworthy. There is none of the anxiety which pervades Plutarch's pamphlet on whether an old man should engage in public affairs. Plutarch fears that old age and infirmities might prompt a withdrawal, that old age might blunt and baffle duty and lead to retirement, which Plutarch regards as pure laziness. By contrast, Paul avers that he has, quote, much confidence to command, paresia echion epitasein, even as he makes a show of relinquishing it. Paul does not hesitate to advise Philemon on how to dispose of the affairs of his household. Paul actively negotiates, offering to repay Philemon for any debt that Onesimus might owe. Paul engages in social coercion, reminding Philemon that he owes him his own life. Paul expresses his confidence that Philemon will do even more than he suggests, and just in case Philemon does not, Paul threatens to come and inspect the situation in person when he is released from prison. The impression made by the old Paul in the epistle to Philemon is very different from that which Juncus predicates of the old man who attempts to remain engaged in public life. Let me quote just briefly what Juncus says. If the old man has the audacity to enter the agora, he provokes the laughter of those who see him, for he cannot see properly and cannot hear when people shout. Trying to make his way forward, he trips and falls. He is accused of getting in the way and using up the common air of the city. And when he appears in the assembly, he is not included among the ranks of the tribes, nor is he capable of holding office on account of the aforementioned disabilities. Rather, he is bowed and withered, misshapen and feeble, and in spirit, as the saying goes, he has become a child again. Paul, by contrast, in his letter to Philemon, is more like the elder Cato, of whom Plutarch said, quote, he did not think age an exemption from service to the public, but considered that service his indispensable duty. So I will leave you with this question. On what basis did Paul exhibit confidence even in his old age? Although Paul was not a man of Cato's social class or political power, on what basis did the old Paul have such confidence? And of course, I would like to suggest that Paul found that confidence in the new identity that he had in Christ. Thank you for listening to my paper, and I look forward to your comments and questions.
Well, thank you, Larry. You have given us, as usual, a thorough examination of the term presbyteries and old age in antiquity, and with regard to Philemon 9, and a great curtain raiser for our conference on Saturday. So thank you very much for that thorough investigation.
Thank you, Don. Let me see if there are questions or comments from my very learned colleagues.
We're waiting.
Alan?
Thanks, Larry. That was terrific.
Thank you.
I'd read Ronald Hock's essay quite some years ago and was so taken by its originality at the time, and you've really expanded that terrifically. I'm conscious that here in Australia, amongst our Indigenous peoples, there is a real respect that is given, sometimes through the use of the term elder, but frequently in just ordinary exchanges with the use of the term old man. And old man is used not simply as an indication of a person's age, but an indication of a person's standing. And that has always influenced me in looking at Philemon 9, particularly if we take the sense that Paul is actually entering into a negotiation of the affairs of Philemon's household effectively as the paterfamilias.
Yes.
So I'm just wondering your response to that.
Oh, Alan, I think you're absolutely right. As you could deduce from the argument of my paper, I don't think that the commentators are correct in narrowing the nature of Paul's appeal to Philemon and forcing a choice between an appeal to the emotions, that is, a pathetic appeal on the one hand, and an ethical appeal, an appeal to character on the other hand. I think Paul, in his letter to Philemon, it's a very sophisticated and charming letter, full of word plays and puns, so well constructed. And I think Paul is simultaneously appealing to Philemon's emotion, that is, his love and affection, his agape and splankna, but he is also appealing to the respect and the status that old age represents. I think Paul is simultaneously doing that. So I would argue that Paul is exploiting all of the opportunities provided by ancient rhetorical theory. He is simultaneously appealing to the emotions, but he is also making an appeal based upon his character. He has the confidence, the parousia to command, but he prefers to appeal on the basis of love. Thank you, Alan, very much. Are there other comments or questions?
Yes, can I make a comment, just a linguistic note, because I thoroughly agree with Larry, what Larry said about the status of old age. And that Jerome, when he translated the Greek text, he translated it as senex.
Yes.
And that's so that, I mean, I think we have to, I mean, Jerome was contemporary with Augustine. Augustine. And so I think he was bilingual in Greek and Latin. And so I think we should rely on his translation as being pretty accurate.
John, you're absolutely right. And because of the constraints of time today, I wasn't able to present the full patristic evidence. I only lifted up Theodoret of Cyrrhus, who is one of my favorite patristic commentators. But actually, John Chrysostom also insists upon the fact that presbytes designates Paul's age, his old age. And John, you're absolutely right. The patristic commentators are unanimous. It was only beginning with Calvin that the argument begins to emerge, in the modern period, that Paul is appealing not to his age, but to his apostolic office. But the patristic evidence is unanimous. And you're right to lift up Jerome because he was bilingual.
Thank you. Anyway, thank you, Larry. I appreciated your talk very much. Thanks.
Thank you.
Alana,
Thank you so much.
Alana, unmute. Can't hear you.
Oh, Larry, I was just going to say, absolutely agreeing with what you say and Alan and now John's addition. But it goes right back to Homer, doesn't it? The respect for old age. I mean, disability, unfortunately, especially physical disability, is pitiable and is mocked, but old age, no. I mean, it does add that sort of venerability. That makes really good sense to me, right from the word go in your exposition of Greco-Roman thought on it. Can I add a little side comment? This isn't really relevant to what you were saying, but just on the demography issue, what people do need to factor in, and it doesn't apply to Paul, of course, is the fact that probably at least 1 in 5 Roman women died in childbirth, and that's not about their social status. When you think that both Cicero's daughter and Caesar's daughter died in childbirth, and they would have had the best medical attention possible. So I'm just wondering if some of that demography. I did read some of it ages ago. I've now forgotten it. Sorry. But they do need to factor in, don't they? Women generally dying in childbirth, and not necessarily only lower class women. In fact, they may have done better because they may have, in fact, walked more than very well-to-do women. They may have got out and about more, and also, had babies younger on the whole because they weren't married for, dynastic and so on reasons. But that does affect the statistics, doesn't it? It doesn't
Yes.
apply to Paul. I know it doesn't apply to Paul, but I'm just thinking.
No, but in fact, I would say, Alana, that both of your points are opposite. First, the literature on old age repeatedly refers to Homer's Nestor as the wise counselor. And even though Cicero concedes that he is a bit garrulous, but Nestor is there. And of course, the great Solon is quoted. Solon, who famously said, "I grow old always learning." So you're quite right to refer to those things, Alana. Your second point is also very important. Unfortunately, the literature on old age from the ancient world is almost entirely the product of upper class men. And we don't know as much as we would like to know about elderly women. Now, this is where the portrait busts that are analyzed so carefully by Karen Cockayne in her wonderful book, Experiencing Old Age. She has dozens and dozens of pictures showing elderly women, and many of them are libertini. So these are ordinary working people. And it is clear that they did not attempt to conceal their age. They are depicted with wrinkles and sagging flesh, and all of the attributes of old age. Evidently, they found that it conveyed gravity and dignity and wisdom and experience. But your point, Alana, about the death of young women in childbirth and how that impacts the demographic calculations, you're absolutely right. And I have a colleague in New York City who wrote a wonderful book on women in classical antiquity. It has a somewhat provocative title, Goddesses, Whores, Wives, and Slaves, Women in Classical Antiquity. And the best thing about that book is that she does a rather thorough survey of tombstone inscriptions in which it is frequently lamented that a young woman has died in childbirth. So she calculates all of that. I think she's the only one I know of who has devoted real attention to it. Her name is Sarah. Her name is Sarah Pomeroy.
With the census returns, Larry,
Yes.
it's calculated that by the age of 5, half the children would have died, and by the age of 10, another half. And there are very few people living over the age of 70. In fact, I think there's about a couple of people who were in their 80s, but that's about all. And from the census returns.
Yes, thank you, Don, very much. Yes, that's really important data, and it puts into the foreground that Paul would have been in a tiny proportion of the population that reached the age of 60 or
Yes.
more. You're absolutely right.
And
I really wish that the papyrus evidence were more expansive. I could only find two papyri that where the author gives his exact age, and I thought perhaps that was my fault, that I'm not very skilled at research in the papyri. But then when I consulted the papyrological commentary of our wonderful colleague Peter Artsgrabner, the two papyri that I found are the same two that that he adduces, and evidently he did not know anymore.
Yes, the in the marriage certificates in Roman Egypt, you get ages, but that's of fairly fairly young ages, and no evidence of how people lived too. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm just wondering if my colleagues Jim Harrison and Mark Harding, if you're still awake at this hour and have any suggestions for me.
Larry, your comment very early on about the pastoral epistles. Many years ago, I read Speke's commentary on the pastorals. He makes a point of saying that maybe the different vocabulary and more ponderous style of the pastorals means that Paul is writing these as a very old man. I think I didn't agree with that point of view then, and you've given me further ammunition for not going along with Speke tonight, because we've got Philemon with all its sort of spikiness and Pauline energy and dynamism, and that's a genuine Pauline letter. So I don't buy Speke's view. The other point I was going to make, that Ronald Stark's book on early Christianity, I think that's a great book. And one of the telling things that he says is that Christian fathers married off their daughters at a much later age than is typical in Greek and Roman households, which meant that it was more likely that they survived childbirth because they were, instead of being 13 or 14, were actually 19 or 20.
Mark,
that's
you're
just a comment.
Oh, you're absolutely right. You probably know that I'm also a big fan of that book by Stark, and yeah, that's really important, that Christian fathers married off their daughters later in life so that they were not trying to give birth when they were only 13 and 14 years old. Your earlier point about the pastoral epistles, there is a new book by a young woman from Canada, called Honoring Old Age, and it's a study of the pastoral epistles. I'm currently reviewing the book for Novum Testamentum. It's an interesting book. She takes an anthropological approach, which is similar to the observation that Alan Cadwallader makes. She highlights the respect that old people have in societies, in primitive societies, and she then argues that we see that also in the pastoral epistles. But you're right, Mark, to highlight the contrast between the style of the pastoral epistles and Paul's letter to Philemon. Paul's letter to Philemon is vigorous and brilliant and calculating and actually charming. The word plays. The word plays. Just in case Philemon has missed the point, Paul finally says, "Nigh Adelphi, yes, brother, I want some Oneimen," using a cognate form of the name Onesimus. And then he says, "Refresh my splunkna." And a few verses earlier, Paul had defined Onesimus as his splunkna. So it's just such an astonishingly vigorous letter and confident letter. And it contrasts so strongly with the anxiety of Plutarch about what might happen to an old man who tries to remain active in public affairs. None of that anxiety is present in Paul's epistle. Also interesting, Mark, even though Paul is in prison, when he writes to Philemon, nowhere in the letter to Philemon does he mention the possibility of his own death, even though the letter to the Philippians mentions death as a possible outcome, but not in Philemon. Paul just excludes the possibility of death. I hope to also write a sequel to the paper that I've presented tonight, in which I compare passages from Philippians and 2 Corinthians 4-5 with the epistles of Seneca, where Seneca talks about old age and death. That makes a really insightful comparison, and I'll be turning my attention to that later in the summer.
Larry,
Yes.
what's the connection between presbytes and presbyteros?
Yes, so the designation of a person as an elder, right, is a development, and the connection between these two terms linguistically reflects the institutional and social reality that the elders, the presbyteroi, when they begin to appear in early Christian literature, for example, First Clement, they are old men. they are not young people. Now, John Barclay published a fascinating seminal essay some years ago in New Testament Studies, in which he argued that in the authentic Pauline letters, there is no age requirement for office. Barclay's article was called "Neither Old Nor Young." But by the time you reach the end of the first century, with the pastoral epistles, with First Clement, it is clear that in order to be a presbyteros, to be an elder in the Christian community, age is a requirement.
As it was with the Jewish synagogues, I believe, yeah.
Yes, that's exactly right. And in fact, some of the commentators refer to the use of presbyteros in Jewish literature as a context for Philemon.
I don't understand this technology. I probably can't be heard, can I?
Yes.
Yes, John.
Oh,
John,
oh.
we
Professor,
John, it's so good to see you.
And you too, Professor. Thank you. Yes, back in the real world, and I'm very pleased to be here. Just at the end, when you made that fascinating point, which you left with us, that is Paul's attitude to old age affected by his new being in Christ? Is it
Yes.
in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, that quotation which he says something like, although our outer man is fading away, the inner man is being renewed day by day. Now, I know several old people who find that pastorally very comforting, but do you think that that does relate to the aging process at all?
Oh, John, you're absolutely right. And it's that essay that I want to turn my attention to.
We did mention 1 Corinthians 5 just now, yes.
Yes, it's actually 2 Corinthians 4, 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 1 down to chapter 5, verse 10,
yes.
Where precisely Paul suggests that the Christ event, his being in Christ,
yes,
has partitioned the self. And it is no longer Paul who lives, it is what? Christ who lives in him.
Yes.
John, when I finally turn my attention to that essay, I'm going to employ the categories that have been developed by an Israeli sociologist and gerontologist named Chaim Hazan.
Yes.
In his books and articles, he says that there are two dominant attitudes toward age. First, the ageless self, the fact that a person like Cicero or Cato maintains the integrity of the self despite age. And then on the other hand, there is the view of selfless age, and is that the self is destroyed and vitiated piece by piece. And I intend to use those categories because in the text, John, to which you refer, 2 Corinthians 4 and 5, Paul transcends those two categories.
Yes.
Paul imagines a self that is growing in strength, even though the outer, the exoanthropos, is fading away. And yet, this self that is growing is still exposed fully to the ravages of age.
So this is something wholly new in ancient civilization.
Yes, it's something. Yeah. It's something.
Paul does it again.
It's something for which I cannot find a parallel, even in the letters of Seneca.
Yes.
Seneca defends the idea. In Seneca, you find both the ageless self and selfless age. But what you don't find in Seneca is the new self that emerges in Christ, and that's what I want to think. That's what I want to think about. I don't know. I'm probably not sufficiently profound or gifted as a theologian to follow Paul down into the depths in which a new self has emerged. But like Edwin Judge, I'm able to recognize that something distinctive is emerging in regard to old age in 2 Corinthians 4 and 5, precisely the passage that you mentioned.
Just before you go, this isn't a moment for being personal, but I do want to say the blessing you gave me at the SEC conference 6 years ago energized me through 6 very difficult years. Thank you.
Oh, you're so kind, John, and you were in my prayers and you were in, as Paul said, you were in my heart
Thank you.
constantly during those years.
There was a very good sense of living inside Paul's message, but we won't go further into that now.
You know, I read your sermons that you delivered during those years. They were sent to me by Alana and others.
Wow, thank you.
So, Don, are there any more comments? I know I've taken, as usual.
I'm looking, Larry. I'm looking. Has anyone got any other questions or comments? Craig.
Yes.
Craig.
Yes.
Are you saying something? Are you giving a comment or a question?
No, I've just been dropping in and out, listening to it, and
Okay.
I just finally completed my PhD processes, and perhaps just like to thank Larry for all he did with that.
I'm very proud.
Thought
I'm
through
very
it.
proud of your work, Craig, and grateful for the fact that I was involved.
Yes, it's been a great pleasure, Larry, and I've just finished reading your latest book on equality.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad you got your hands on it. Yeah, that's a brand new book.
Yeah, and a great piece of work too. Fantastic stuff.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Larry, for that marvelous presentation. And we look forward to hearing from you again on Saturday, when the hour will be quite better than it is now.
Yes, that's exactly right. But I have to say, Don, that the knowledge, the expectation that I would be reconnecting with some of my best friends and colleagues in the world. When I awakened at 3 o'clock this morning, and when I thought of all of you there in Australia, I bounded out of bed with excitement and energy.
Larry, can I add, it is wonderful to see you reconnecting with us all. We're so delighted, and just your interactions and the generosity that you show when people ask you a question or make a comment is something that is very characteristic of you and something that we've always valued. And I'm just going to add one other little credit to you. Not only did you supervise those 12 students, but you know, each one of them has a book. And
Yes.
almost all of them, all of them, despite the difficulties in the market, almost all of them have a JOB. Not
That's
quite
right.
all.
And could I provide a very quick update? One of my next to the last student at Macquarie was James Unwin. And his dissertation, his Macquarie dissertation, is about to be published. The presses are rolling. It'll be published by Fortress Press.
Right. Do you know what the title will be?
It may be the same. It may be the same title that he used for the dissertation itself. That title was Subversive Spectacles.
Right.
And as you may remember, Don, James Unwin compared Paul's use of language and images from gladiatorial combat with the use of that language and imagery in the epistles of Seneca. Yes,
that's right. That's right. Well, yeah, I look forward to reading that dissertation.
Yeah, he has revised it a little bit and added a new introduction to bring everything up to date. And it is brilliant. It's brilliant, and the presses are rolling on that right now. Yes, and Larry, you have reminded us again of the need for looking at all the sources from the ancient world to understand the New Testament. And I think it's very important, very important. Yes, thank you. We have to look not only at all of the literary sources, both Greek and Latin, but we also have to look at the papyri and even the iconographic sources, all of
Yes.
those,
Yeah.
all of those portrayals of old people on tombstones. That's just really important.
Yes. Yeah. Well, thank you again, Larry.
Yeah.
And look forward to seeing you on Saturday.
Yes,
Thank-
I'm excited about that too.
Yeah.
Look forward to that, and I look forward to hearing the other papers that will be presented.
Yes. Thank you, Larry.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
And good to see you, John.
Thank you. Yes. Good to be. See you on Saturday.
Yeah.